Chapter 17 of the Romance of Modern Engineering. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by William Tadeusz Cheng. The Romance of Modern Engineering by Archibald Williams. Chapter 17. Floating Docks. However accurately planned and carefully finished a vessel may be, the time comes when it has to go onto the sick list. Its ailment may only amount to the need of a fresh coating or two of paint, or the accumulation of barnacles and marine weeds on its bottom may have precipitously diminished its speed. Or perhaps a storm has handled it roughly, and a plate has started far below the waterline, or it has run foul of a rock and crushed in a part of its steel walls, and last but not least, shot and shell may have worked their wicked will upon it. The repair of a small boat is a simple matter. Just beach it and turn it over. A small ship may be careened or heeled over till a portion is exposed to the workmen. But when huge vessels, liners or ironclads, weighing thousands of tons have to be handled, the question assumes an altogether more serious aspect. In most of the large ports and dockyards of the world is to be found a contrivance known as a dry dock, an excavation walled and floored with concrete and masonry, and furnished at one end with stout gates or caissons. The vessel in for repairs is admitted into the dock, the entrance is closed, and the great pumps on the dock edge set to work to drain off the water. As it recedes, the ship settles slowly down onto the keel blocks over which she has been centered, and shores are placed on either side to prevent her heeling over. At last, the dock is dry, and the carpenters and other mechanics can get to work with scrapers, riveters, and the special tools requisite for the job in hand. The rapid increase in the dimensions and tonnage of ships has necessitated a corresponding augmentation of the measurements of dry docks. The Cedric, Oceanic, and Kaiser Wilhelm II could no more get into the docks of 50 years ago than a man could squeeze himself into the garments of his 5-year-old son. Dry docks 750 feet in length are now quite common, and in several cases this longitude is considerably exceeded. At Liverpool we find a graving, i.e. dry dock, 1,000 feet long, at Glasgow one of 880 feet, at Tilbury one of 873 feet, at Belfast one of 850 feet. In order to accommodate the largest vessels, the depth of the water over the sill of the entrance must be somewhat more than the heaviest draught of these vessels, and to receive them at all times and seasons, the level must be calculated for spring tides, when the tides are at their maximum and minimum heights. The construction of a dry dock 800 feet long, 100 feet broad, and 50 to 60 feet deep is a great undertaking, for these dimensions by no means fully represent the amount of mere excavation. If you dig a deep hole in your back garden in normally wet weather, you would probably find, on reaching a depth of a few feet, that water begins to ooze through. If, therefore, you require a watertight pit of given dimensions, it will be necessary to clear out an extra foot or so in all directions to allow for a cement or brick lining on 5 faces. Should your object be a pit at once very deep and dry, your difficulties will be increased by the external pressure of the water, which may be roughly calculated at 1 pound for every 2 feet of depth, below the top level of the water-bearing stratum. The thickness of your walls must be increased, and their joints sealed exactly, or you may find that your labor has been in vain. The dry dock engineer has to contend with the same difficulties in an aggravated form. His walls are lofty, his floors very spacious. Unless the greatest care is taken, the walls will be bulged in by the earth pressure, and both walls and floor penetrated by the water that must be present in the ground near the sea. And inasmuch as the dock when dry is practically an empty tank, its total weight or adhesion to the ground beneath must be sufficient to secure it against a tendency to float. The masonry is therefore very massive, and the bottom made in the form of an inverted arch to resist upward pressure and to enable the walls to stand the thrust inwards from the backing. So severe are these thrusts that the Aberdeen dock, to take an instance, built in 1883-85 of concrete with granite facings, had been so much disturbed and cracked by 1896 that the owners had to decide between spending £68,000 on its repair and rebuilding the dock throughout. On the Tyne also, the bottom of a newly completed dock went wrong, and cost an additional £30,000 before it could handle a ship. These are, however, exceptional cases, and many docks exist today which have done their duty satisfactorily for years and should last for many more to come, since well-laid ashlar work in an ordinary climate will stand practically forever. The construction of graving docks is nevertheless a difficult and uncertain matter in some localities, especially in those where the ground is of a sandy or porous nature. Under such conditions, the walls and floor must be borne up on long piles reaching down to a more solid substratum. In fact, it is sometimes impossible to build a graving dock except at a prohibitive cost, and if the necessity for a means of repairing vessels in a certain locality is unavoidable, recourse must be had to some other means for raising the huge floating forts and ocean leviathans out of the water. In 1795, one C. Watson took out a patent for a floating dock, a wooden construction of barge-shaped lines, the ends of which could be closed by doors. A ship having been floated in, the doors were closed and the water pumped out, causing dock and vessel to rise above the water line. A print is extant of such a dock lifting the brig Mercury at Rotherhithe about 1800. Watson's contrivance was very primitive and capable of lifting only what we should consider very small craft, but since his time immense improvements have been made, mainly owing to the substitution of metal for wood. In 1859, Rennie built a large iron floating dock for use at Cartagena, which is still doing useful work. The floating docks of today are very much more imposing structures than Rennie's, and are of steel, like the ships they are destined to lift. The floating dock is in idea a series of pontoons rigidly attached to one another and of great displacement. When full, the pontoons naturally sink, and as they are emptied, their natural buoyancy serves not only to raise them to the surface again, but also to lift burdens of a weight equal to the difference between their own weight and their displacement. In section, it either resembles the graving docks, i.e., is of a U shape, or the letter L. The latter class is known as an offshore dock, since the upright member must be attached by parallel booms to the shore or some rigid hold in order that it may not heel over when carrying a load on its horizontal pontoon. The U-dock is independent, and may be towed from place to place like an ordinary vessel. Floating docks have open ends, and are therefore able to handle vessels longer than themselves. The L-docks, being open on one side also, can accommodate ships of greater beam than their pontoons. Modern vessels are very stiff, being practically a powerful form of girder. Their heaviest portion is in the center, and although it would put an undue strain on a liner to lift her by bow and stern, leaving her unsupported amidships, to apply the pressure to the central half of her keel only would not be attended with much risk. So we read that the Nikolaev dock, 174 feet long over blocks, lifted the Rosia, 334 feet long, and the Barrow dock, 240 feet long, was able to partly raise the Empress of China of nearly double its length. The same dock, though only 54 feet in beam, has lifted paddle steamers 68 feet broad. As regards latitude, in dimensions, the floating structure has a decided advantage over the graving dock. Since the latter must have closed ends, it is obvious that the length of the vessels it can accommodate is strictly limited. The same is true of their breadth and draught, so that, given two vessels of equal tonnage but different lines, the one might be able to get into dock, and the other be compelled to go elsewhere, whereas the floating dock would probably be able to handle both with equal ease, or if its buoyancy were not sufficient to lift them clear of the water, it could raise them to a considerable elevation. Many graving docks are for reasons of economy, so built that vessels can enter them only at high tide, and, as a consequence, leave them only under the same conditions. The advantage of this is that during low water the level outside the dock is reduced, and with it the hydrostatic pressure. There is less strain on the dock walls and less leakage. In almost tideless waters, such as those of the Baltic and the Mediterranean, where the level is practically constant, the deep docks must always be subject to heavy pressures, and on the other hand, in localities where the level fluctuates very greatly, as in the St. Lawrence, a dock usable all the year round would have to be of enormous depth. We therefore find the floating dock largely used in preference to the graving, where a constant or very variable level prevails. To render it useful at low water, even in shallow roadsteads, dredging is indeed necessary, but dredging is inexpensive in comparison with excavation and masonry work on dry land. A sudden rise of level makes no difference to its usefulness. A further advantage of the floating dock will easily be recognized by anyone who has passed through a river lock. That lock must be completely emptied or completely filled, whether the passing craft be a rowboat or a steamer. The smaller the craft, the greater will be the amount of water moved. Now, the pumping dry of graving docks is a costly operation, and would bear heavily on the owners of a small ship in inverse proportion to the size of their vessel. A floating dock, on the other hand, need be emptied only until the deck of its pontoons is at such a depth that the vessel's keel will clear it as it floats in, and the cost becomes much more directly proportional to the displacement. The two finest examples of floating docks are those at Bermuda and Algiers, near New Orleans, built respectively for the British and United States governments. Messrs. Stanfield and Clark, of Westminster, were responsible for the designs of these mammoth structures. In 1869, a dock was taken from England to Bermuda and stationed there for strategical purposes. It is 381 feet long and 84 feet between the side walls, and will lift a ship of 10,000 tons, heavier than the line of battle ship of the date of its construction. But so rapidly have the weights and dimensions of large vessels increased that our warships are now 500 feet in length and of 15,000 tons displacement. The old Bermuda dock has therefore become obsolete, and the Admiralty was obliged to replace it by a structure more suited to modern requirements. Borings were made at many points on the island with the intention of deciding a position for a graving dock, but with the geological formation proved to be such as would render the construction of a graving dock a very expensive matter. The authorities therefore ordered a floating dock of unequal dimensions to cost £250,000, inclusive of its transportation to Bermuda. The new dock was built by Messrs. C.S. Swan and Hunter of Wallsend-on-Tyne. It is 545 feet long, and has a clear width between the top of the walls of 100 feet. The walls themselves are 53¼ feet high and 435 feet long, and form girders of enormous strength. 3 pontoons, secured to the lower portions of the walls by fishplate joints, lugs, and taper pins, form the bottom or deck of the dock. The middle pontoon is a rectangle 96 by 300 feet. The end pontoons, each 120 feet long, taper for 49 feet towards their outer extremities to facilitate towing. The dock, with all of its machinery, weighs 6,500 tons and has a lifting power up to deck level of 15,500 tons, though by using the pound formed by the bulwarks surrounding the pontoon decks, additional lifting power up to 17,500 tons can be gained. When called upon to perform its maximum lift, the dock is sunk until the summit of its walls is but 2 feet 6 inches above sea level. Water is admitted into the 3 pontoons and the 2 side walls, and from them removed by 8 16-inch centrifugal pumps at a rate sufficient to lift an ironclad of 15,000 tons in 3½ hours. In order that the deck may not tilt as it rises, the whole is divided into 56 divisions, each of which is separately connected with the pumps. By turning off cocks, water can be left in any desired divisions, and the dock forced to incline in any direction for purposes of cleaning and repairs. It is especially important that a structure of this kind should be self-docking, that is, able to lift any part of itself clear of the water. To expose the bottom of one side, the dock is first lowered to a depth of 20 to 21 feet, the water inside the wall compartments being brought to the same level as that of the water outside. The dock is then raised by emptying the pontoons, and when these are exhausted, the water is released from the side to be exposed, until the outer corner is 2 feet or more clear. The pontoons are lifted in turn by withdrawing the pins of one and allowing it to float while the rest of the dock sinks. The pontoon is then made fast to the walls at its floating level, and the dock emptied, so exposing the whole of the bottom of the raised pontoon. The 2 end sections can be treated simultaneously and floated if required onto the central portion, but the latter must be moved only when the other pontoons are in position. Electric lights and hauling machinery are distributed over the dock. A crane capable of lifting 5 tons runs along each wall from end to end. The Bermuda dock was launched in Wallsend in February 1902, the largest floating thing that ever took the water since the time of Noah. It was then towed round to the Medway for a trial with a battleship, before being dispatched on its 4,000-mile voyage to Bermuda and moored in the deep part of the Sea Reach opposite Port Victoria. The Admiralty selected the Sans Pareil as the test ship on account of her shape, and the fact that the peculiar distribution of her weight makes her a somewhat difficult vessel to handle. The battleship was moored just above Sheerness, at about the time of high water, about 11:30 a.m. She was taken in charge by 3 dockyard tugs, and brought up to the entrance of the floating dock. Steel wire hawsers were made fast to the bow, and these being secured to the winches on the dock, the hauling in commenced. There was a strong breeze blowing down Reach at the time, and on the flood this had raised waves of considerable size for enclosed water, the tide running in this part of the Medway with considerable force. With the turn of the ebb, wind and tide being together, the water was smoother, but still there was considerable motion. This, naturally, did not affect the dock in the slightest degree, as the whole of the pontoon was 28 feet below the waterline, and only the tops of the walls were above the surface. The heavy battleship of over 10,000 tons displacement, she was drawing only 27 feet, had to be hauled in against the tide, which was now running somewhat over 3 knots. Naturally, care had to be taken to keep her keel fairly parallel with the sides of the dock, for, had she got across, her spur would speedily have made a rent in the walls of the dock. With the powerful hauling appliances, however, there was no fear of this, and the vessel was under complete control with the wire hawsers on each side. The ship was centered on the keel blocks, and the upper rows of shores were fixed in position in something under 2 hours, and the work of pumping out the dock was commenced at a few minutes past 2 o'clock. Pumping was continued for 50 minutes, by the end of which time the dock and ship had been raised 13 feet, and it was then necessary to put in another line of shores. This operation occupied a considerable time, and it was late in the evening before the work was concluded, and the ship raised out of the water. The trial completed, the dock was towed from Sheerness to Bermuda by 2 tugs, the Zwarte Zee and Oceaan of Rotterdam. The only place at which it was necessary to call was the Azores, where the tugs replenished their bunkers. The time occupied was 52 days, including the stoppage of 3 or 4 days at the Azores, but the progress was sure though slow, and the dock arrived in perfect safety at its destination. The possible importance of this dock in a naval war in western waters can be judged from the fact that there is no point within 1,000 miles of Bermuda to which a crippled battleship could make for repairs. For some time past the Bermudan authorities have been obliged to send on large vessels to Halifax in Nova Scotia, a voyage which could scarcely be faced by a leaky craft. If strategy demanded, the dock might be taken in tow and removed to a more favorable position near the probable theater of war. The second largest, but most powerful, of floating docks is to be found at the naval base of Algiers in the Gulf of Mexico. This dock is 525 feet long, and is of the same width as the Bermudan. Its lifting power up to pontoon deck level is no less than 18,000 tons, and this may be increased to 20,000 tons by utilizing the pound. It is 650 tons lighter than the English dock, and weight for weight more efficient, since every 33 tons has a lifting efficiency of 100 tons, equal to that of 39 tons in the English dock. The general arrangement of machinery is much the same in both docks. The Algiers dock is moored to the shore by 2 pivoted and hinged booms, which are useful also as gangways. After its completion by the Maryland Steel Company, Sparrows Point, Maryland, it was transported to its berth at Algiers and given a trial with the Illinois of about 12,000 tons. As in the case of the Sans Pareil, the docking was conducted without a hitch, though the time occupied was considerably less than that of the Sheerness trial. The contract time for raising the ship clear was 3 hours, after pumping had once begun. It actually took 3 hours to get the Illinois in position and 2 hours less 3 minutes more to raise the pontoon decks 3 feet above water. The Americans strengthened the bilges of their ironclads with the strong bilge docking keels, forming with the keel proper a level bottom, since the vessel settles on 3 bearings simultaneously. No shores are required except those used for roughly centering the vessel, and as consequence a vessel might be completely docked, if built on the American plan, in the time taken to adjust one constructed on English lines. It remains to be proved whether the presence of bilge keels detracts from a vessel's speed. If not, the American practice appears very preferable, for in wartime dispatch in all operations is of the finest importance. Some doubts have been thrown upon the stability of the floating dock, and indeed it does look at first sight as though a large tank laden with an ironclad might lose its balance and share the fate of the Royal George. But practical tests banish all such fears, for the Havana dock so burdened would require an effort of 63,502 foot-tons to move it 5 degrees out of the perpendicular, whilst a stress of but 2,802 foot-tons would incline the ironclad to the same extent. In other words, the Leyden dock is over 20 times as stable as the ship itself, while it is never likely to have to face such rough weather. One of the strongest points in favor of this type of dock is its mobility. At its birth, it is constructed in the most convenient site possible, viz., the yard of the shipbuilder. On launching, it has the whole world open to it. From England one goes to Stettin, another to Havana, a third to Bermuda. On the American side, the voyage from Maryland to Algiers is easily made. The only serious mishap in such journeys was that of the Durban dock, which went aground and became a wreck. Commercial prosperity not unfrequently deserts one port for another. The floating dock can follow, while the graving dock remains idle. Messrs. Clark and Stanfield, in a treatise on the movable type, lay special stress on the value of mobility in war. They see no reason why a floating dock, convoyed by a powerful tug, and fully equipped with stores and tools suitable for rapid repairs, should not follow the movements of a fleet. As they point out, the first sea fight between fairly matched fleets would leave a number of wrecks on both sides, and the commander who had the nearest base, and so could come up to time, again the first, would hold an enormous advantage. In home waters, too, the dock could play its part. Arsenals are generally placed up some river or creek out of reach of the enemy's guns on the open sea. A ship disabled at the mouth of the Thames, for instance, would have to make for Chatham, up the narrow channel of the Medway. Were she to sink in the channel, the arsenal would be effectively cut off from any other ships in need of assistance. The floating dock could be moved down the Thames, ready to pick up any of the lame ducks, and give them first aid, in the shape of temporary repairs that would make their hulls tight and in a fit state to navigate the home channels to the fully equipped and protected base hospitals or arsenals. It has been pointed out, with regard to the new Gibraltar docks, that they are open to the fire of an enemy from several points, and the proposition made to add or substitute a floating dock which could lie in the harbor almost submerged by day, and at night rise to pick up ships needing assistance, or even be towed round to the other side of Europa Point, where it would be protected by the headlands. In addition to mobility, the floating dock may claim the following advantages. It can be rapidly constructed, and its price more accurately calculated than in the case of a graving dock. As an example of quick erection, we may instance the Havana dock, of 10,000 tons of lifting power, completed in 181 days from the date of laying the first plate. This contrasts favorably with the average time of 3 or 4 years required for the construction of a graving dock of equal capacity. From the workman's point of view, also, the floater has its recommendation. Instead of having to work at the bottom of a hole where the light is bad and the air damp, he finds himself on a well-lighted platform swept by the breezes, which quickly dry the paint, and free from the discomfort often caused by leakage into a graving dock. The latter, if properly made, is more durable than its metal rival. But in these days of rapid advance, types become obsolete so soon that this objection need not be considered. The best testimonial to the general advantages of the floating dock is that the number of such structures increases from year to year. The more they are used, the more they are liked. End of chapter 17.